All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. As a climate scientist, I've put together this specific briefing for you, the Agricultural Policy Advisor, because we need to look very closely at the converging threats facing our upcoming Kharif season. We're looking at a situation where meteorology and macroeconomics are literally colliding in real time. It is absolutely crucial we understand the mechanics of this threat if we're going to secure India's food sovereignty. To grasp the sheer scale of our vulnerability, we have to start right here, 55%. That's the chunk of our net-sown agricultural land that is entirely rain-fed. So, despite all the incredible advances in irrigation over the last few decades, more than half of our agricultural economy is still completely at the mercy of the skies. When the monsoon falters, it doesn't just dry up a few fields. It sends a massive shockwave across the entire national economy. Okay, moving into Section 1, the El Niño climate threat. We really need to unpack the specific atmospheric anomalies that are currently brewing in the Pacific. So, the primary meteorological engine threatening to suppress our southwest monsoon this year is, you guessed it, El Niño. This climatic phenomenon is characterized by an unusual warming of surface waters out in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific Ocean. And while that temperature shift might seem a world away, it completely disrupts what we call the Walker circulation. That fundamentally alters global weather patterns and basically chokes off the crucial moisture-laden winds that usually sweep right over South Asia. The mechanical difference here is pretty stark. Picture a normal monsoon. You've got strong, west-blowing trade winds bringing this robust, evenly distributed moisture straight to the Indian subcontinent. It's exactly what we want. But under El Niño conditions, those trade winds weaken. The warm water gets pushed east, and the result for us is suppressed, incredibly patchy rainfall. Instead of that steady rain we rely on, we're looking at severe dry spells spreading right across our core agricultural zones in central and western India. Now, seeing that massive Pacific threat, you're probably wondering, can our local ocean dynamics, specifically the Indian Ocean, step in and save our harvest? Well, the answer lies in the Indian Ocean Dipole, or IOD. A positive IOD brings higher sea surface temperatures to the western Indian Ocean, which historically acts as a fantastic shock absorber, supporting enhanced rainfall over our subcontinent. But here's the catch. Current meteorological data forecasts the IOD to be merely neutral or maybe just mildly positive this season. So the key takeaway here is that while it might offer a tiny bit of relief, it simply won't have the muscle to fully neutralize the drying effects of a really strong El Niño. Which brings us to Section 2, rainfall deficits and market prices. Let's take these atmospheric deficits and translate them into actual, on-the-ground macroeconomic risks. The Meteorological Department just downgraded this season's rainfall projection to 90% of the long-period average. That number puts us dangerously close to a functionally deficient monsoon. If this forecast holds up, guys, we are staring down the barrel of the weakest monsoon in 11 years. And historically, we can map these deficits directly to economic pain. Just look at 2014 and 2023. Both below normal years that triggered sharp spikes in food inflation and literally forced shifts in monetary policy, like delayed interest rate easing. Looking at our 2026 forecast of 90%, historical precedent is flashing red, warning us of severe upside risks to inflation. But as you're advising the ministry, you have to remember this. The distribution of the rainfall matters way more than just the seasonal average. It's not just about the total volume of water in the bucket, right? Severe dry spells are currently projected for those absolutely critical months of August and September. A deficit during that specific window will drastically impact crop sowing, stunt growth phases, and ultimately decimate our yields. Now, compounding this climate threat is a very real geopolitical reality. Let's look at Section 3, cascading fuel and transport costs, and examine what experts are calling a polycrisis. Think about how this polycrisis cascades step by step. First, you have conflict in the Middle East disrupting shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which is a route that handles up to a third of global fertilizer shipments. That disruption causes imported crude oil and raw fertilizer prices to spike. What happens next? Our domestic agricultural transport and farming input costs absolutely surge. Finally, all that compounded cost slams into the domestic market as severe food inflation. It's a total domino effect. And the global shock to these essential nutrients is staggering. We're looking at urea futures up nearly 32%, ammonia and phosphate both up over 20%. Since India relies heavily on imports for these exact fertilizers, Farmers' profit margins are getting completely wiped out before the seeds are even in the ground. This margin compression doesn't just hurt the farmer, it shocks the entire broader economy. When farmers pay more for fertilizer but get a lower yield because of those dry spells, rural household incomes plummet. This instantly drags down discretionary demand for consumer goods. Think tractors, two-wheelers, the whole shebang. Plus, it places a massive fiscal burden on the state because rural workers are forced to rely heavily on MGNREJ public employment programs just to make ends meet. Knowing this storm is brewing, let's move to Section 4. Export policies as inflation buffers. How do we deploy our macroeconomic levers to actually manage this shock? Well, as the IMF rightly points out, proactively deploying our stockpiles is one of the most effective, immediate shock absorbers we have against headline inflation. A really well-designed policy to liquidate cereal buffer stocks can do wonders to smooth out price volatility when harvests fail. And fortunately, we are actually in a fantastic position to do exactly that. Our central pool currently holds more than double the required norms for cereal buffer stocks. We're sitting at 200% of what is mandated. This gives the government immense leverage to release grains and stabilize open market domestic prices when that monsoon deficit really starts to bite. Of course, another major lever is trade policy, specifically export bans. But this is a bit of a double-edged sword. Imposing bans on exports of wheat, non-basmati rice, and sugar does successfully insulate domestic consumers from price spikes and buffers that headline inflation. However, we have to objectively weigh the trade-offs. These bans deprive our local farmers of really lucrative international prices, they widen the national current account deficit, and honestly, they put a huge strain on relationships with global trade partners who rely heavily on Indian agriculture. Finally, let's look at Section 5, mapping hyperlocal climate risk. Because to shift from reactive to proactive, we've got to drill down to the micro level. Broad national forecasts are simply no longer enough to protect our agricultural economy. If we know this polycrisis is on our doorstep, how do we actually build systemic resilience on the ground? Here's how this translates into actionable policy interventions for your desk. The absolute most critical step is developing hyper-local to LUCA level, or block-level climate risk maps. We need to be providing real-time micro-weather advisories directly to farmers so they can actually adjust their sowing times. We also need to incentivize shifting away from incredibly water-intensive crops, like paddy, in the most vulnerable zones. On top of that, establishing public-private catastrophe insurance pools is a game-changer for protecting state balance sheets, and upgrading our cold chain storage will save whatever yield is successfully harvested. I'm going to leave you with this final thought as you draft your policy recommendations. Navigating this polycrisis requires us to completely rethink how we view the nexus of climate, geopolitics, and our macroeconomy. The tools to predict and adapt are sitting right in front of us. The real question is, are we prepared to transition from merely reacting to these shocks to actively predicting and dismantling them to secure India's food sovereignty? Thanks for joining me in this explainer.